Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to this webinar, Leadership and Safety in Uncertain Situations. My name is Trish Kerin and I'm the Director of the IQME Safety Centre. As you can see here, I have a number of different aspects to my career, and some of that has been in leadership. I'm also currently a board member for NOPSEMA, though the views I will be expressing today do not represent NOPSEMA or the Australian Government. IQME and the IQME Safety Centre are delivering a series of webinars over the coming months so that we can continue to help with people's continuing professional development as they go through these unprecedented times that we're having. So please stay tuned for future webinars coming up. Now, we'll be taking questions at the end, so please feel free to type any questions you have along the way into your questions pane. And I have Fiona working with me in the background, and she'll be reading out the questions to me, and we'll endeavour to get to all your questions. If we don't get to your question, I will try to answer it via email after the webinar has finished. I also just want to say first up that we're all in this together. This webinar will not cover the specific aspects of COVID-19, so you need to seek credible information from your government sources on this topic. I don't have all the magical answers that we all want. All I can do is try and share with you some of my experiences, and hopefully that may help you in some of your situations. So there's no silver bullet to this, no magic answers, but I'm just trying to let you know some of the things that I've done in the past in leadership of crisis situations or difficult situations, and where they might have actually worked and helped. So from the process safety perspective, we talk about these 6 functional aspects of process safety being knowledge and competence, engineering and design, systems and procedures, assurance, human factors and culture. But in the middle, absolutely underpinning all of that is leadership. And leadership is what I want to talk about today, because leadership is the core to maintaining safety in your facilities and in your lives as we go through this very, very challenging time that we're facing. So what is leadership? Well, first of all, leadership is actually a process, which means anybody can learn how to do it. It involves more than one person. There's no such thing as leadership if there's no followership. It's all about influencing people to achieve a common goal. And all leadership definitions pretty much have these elements in common with them. So if I think about my leadership and what I think it is, to me, it's enabling people to be their best and get where they need to be. So that picks up on all of those aspects as part of that process. So what I want to talk about now is the aspects that I sort of base all of my leadership on in the work that I do. And that comes down to partly who we are. Now, some of these things that I'm about to talk about you might think are innate, and some of them can be learned and enhanced. So I'll go through the 6 things that I think actually start to define a little bit about who we are, but also with examples of where they can actually be learned or enhanced. So firstly, I think for a leader, you actually need to have some inspiration. Why are you there? Why would people want to follow you? You need to be inspirational in what you're doing. You need to have vision. If you don't have vision, you don't know where you're going. You certainly can't lead anybody in that direction. And you can learn to have to vision and have visioning techniques so that you can try and see and develop into the future of the directions you might want to go. You need to be trustworthy, and this is something that you can build as you go through life as well, and as you go through the relationships that you're building. So being trustworthy is really important in this process as well. I think leadership is actually a lot about serving others, and this is one that we often forget. We sometimes think that as the leader, the team is there to serve us. It's actually the other way around. We're there to serve the team. Leadership is an act of sacrifice and service, and I think that is all the more important as we go through the times we're currently in. Being empathetic is an interesting one, and I said that these are probably innate things that people have, but I can confess to you that I actually had to learn how to develop and recognise my empathy for others, because I was not very good at it in my younger years. And it took a lot of reflection and a lot of coaching to help me find my empathy for people. And so I think you can even learn some of these things that people think are perhaps more innate and not necessarily a learned behaviour. And lastly, in terms of who we are, I think it's very important, and this links into the serving others part, that leaders actually need to be humble. We don't know everything. We don't know a lot of things, in fact. We need to ask questions, we need to be willing to learn, and we need to be willing to admit when we've made a mistake or when we don't know something. That humility is vital because it helps others see that we're actually human, we're just the same as them. And admittedly, at times of crisis, we actually want our leaders to potentially be better than we are. We want them to be more than we are. But the fact is that we need them to be human. We need them to be like us. And so that's why the humility aspect of this is quite important from that perspective. So if we put aside who we are for a moment, I want to now try and translate these for you into what we do. What are the acts of leadership that we do, the process? So firstly, setting direction. I talked about having vision. Well, you need to have a vision. You need to decide what direction you're going to go in, and then you need to communicate that direction really, really clearly with everybody on the team so that people know where they're going and we don't have people going off in different directions at some point because they're unclear as to what the overall goal that we're trying to achieve is. You need to be yourself. This is around being authentic. Sometimes we try and act out how we see good leaders behave. We try to take on the traits of someone else to be a leader. But the fact is that no one can be more you than you. So we need to focus on being yourself more, but with skill. So this means we don't go and highlight all of our flawed behaviours or traits that we might have. We need to think about how we present to other people, but we need to be authentic about it. So it can be difficult sometimes because we do see people we want to emulate, but at the end of the day, it's far more important to actually just be you. That's who your team members are trying to connect with. They're not trying to connect with someone else as a leader. They're trying to connect with you. And when you do take the time to actually be yourself, it frees up an enormous amount of mental capacity. When you're not trying to remember how to be someone else, you can actually just relax and be yourself. And all of that mental capacity of hiding can be used and rediverted into other valuable parts of your role, of your leadership, of your job to get the outcomes you need. You need to be consistent as a leader. You can't leave your team guessing as to what your position is going to be on something. You can't leave them guessing as to what your mood is going to be on a day-to-day basis. You actually need to be quite even and consistent in how you engage with them. But remember, you've also got to be yourself. And here comes the challenge. You might be having a really, really bad day and you are in a bad mood. But you can't take that out on your team. You need to manage that yourself so that you can lead for your team. Your mood, your behaviour, your positions on things need to be consistent. That's not to say you can't change your mind. Absolutely, you can change your mind. But as people work with you over a period of time, they should be able to generally know which way you're going to answer a particular question or decision that needs to be made. They start to adjust to that. We need to speak up. Now, speaking up is partly around that idea of when something is wrong, actually standing up, putting our hand up and saying, something is wrong. We can't keep doing this. Whether it is the idea of the stop work authority that we have in our facilities around if you see something unsafe, then highlight it, you can intervene. But also speaking up is being willing to say, I don't have the answer. Can someone help me here? Both of those things take courage. And courage, I think, is one of the underpinning elements that we need to recognise. Leadership is not easy. If it was easy, everybody would be doing a fantastic job of it. It's not easy. It is hard. And it takes courage. And we need to speak up. We need to be willing to say, hey, I think this is not right. I think we need to do something different. And that then flows on to you actually have to look after people. If you don't look after the people in your team, they will not look after you as their leader, which means your job all of a sudden becomes so much more difficult to try and bring people together because they actually don't really care whether you succeed or fail. They're in it for themselves. So this is not around being soft on people. We still have to have standards and hold people to standards, but people need to be treated equitably and justly in that. So if someone steps out of line, you bring them back into line in a respectful way. But we also need to make sure that people are taking care of themselves, especially in these sorts of times. Reaching out to people and connecting just to see how they're doing on a regular basis as we all sit isolated in our own homes without the human interaction we're used to in the workplace. Sometimes it's just a matter of, hi, how you doing today? Here's a photo of my dog. Really simple things to look after people's well-being. And that comes into sometimes you actually have to take a moment to have some fun. And having fun is a really important aspect of understanding how people are going, because a good joke or a good laugh can actually do wonders for relieving stress that people may have. And so in a previous role, we actually worked, it was a very high stress environment, and we actually started to institute at that particular role a dress up day once a week where we'd pick a theme and everybody would turn up to our facility dressed up in some theme. It used to make other people a bit nervous at times. They'd wonder what on earth our team was doing, but we were in an incredibly stressful environment. And it just provided us with, we then take a half-hour lunch break together, have a joke, have a laugh about our choice of outfit for the day, and then get back on with the job. That break was just enough to really relieve some of that tension that was going on in that workplace. Now, obviously, times have changed at the moment and we're in different ways, but it might be a funny photo, it might be a joke, it might be just reaching out and having a bit of a laugh with someone. These are really important things to do because they do bring people together and they do allow people to have that stress relief. You need to seek out information. I said at the very start that I don't have all the answers, and I certainly don't have all the answers. There's many answers I don't have. But you need to be willing to ask other people for the answers, for the information, which means you need to admit you don't know it and then ask for that information. Because if we don't have the right information to make decisions, we can't make the right decisions. So that seeking information is absolutely vital. And lastly, we need to reflect. We need to reflect on what we could have done better, on what worked and how we can maybe replicate that and take it forward. Again, in a previous role, one of the things that one of my team members started up was this idea that every week we would email the whole team with what we'd achieved that week. And we would talk about the good things that we achieved and then some personal thing we were looking forward to on the weekend. That was part of the having fun bit. But it gave us a real chance to reflect, to understand where everybody was at. And it was also part of looking after people because everybody got to celebrate in everybody else's success. So some of these little things can actually be really, really valuable going forward. They don't take a lot of time or effort, but they're very important to try and deliver good, clear direction and support to our teams as we go through the future. So all of these actually come together and link up with each other. But every one of these is absolutely underpinned by communication. And communication tends to be an area where at some point we all fall down. And in fact, I have never worked in an organisation where people said the communication in this place is great. Everybody does everything fantastically and we don't need to worry about anything at all. Never once have I seen that. Every organisation I've ever been part of, communication has always been an issue within the organisation. Seems so difficult to get it right because it's actually quite a simple concept. Imparting or exchanging of information, science or process of conveying information. It comes from the Latin communicare, and that means to share. Now that implies that it's two-way because the act of sharing is actually a two-way process. It is the giving and the receiving. So communication clearly needs to be a two-way process in what we do. Now, there are many, many types of communication. We've got the verbal, we've got non-verbal, written, formal, informal, visual, or any combination of the above. And one of the biggest challenges we're facing at the moment is that the non-verbal and the visual are suffering right now in particular. We are talking to people on the phone, we are emailing them, we're instant messaging them, and that's all great. But when we lose the visual cues of how people are responding, how they're receiving the information that we're sharing, we can actually lose understanding of its effectiveness. And that's why things like video conferencing is really important for that process, because it allows us to have some of the visual and some of the non-verbal communication still. But we need to remember how important that level of communication is, that type of communication. Now, for all you engineers in the audience, I actually have the flowchart for how to communicate. And it's important to actually understand how communication works. So the idea is we've got the facts that we want to communicate, and we've got the sender that communicates that information. But we need to remember that that sender has a bias in their mind. So their bias might be that they understand a particular thing and they assume that you do. So they're biased towards you already having that understanding. An understanding you may not have. But then they perform the communication. And so they impart that information. But there's always noise around what is going on during that information sharing. So that can disrupt, it can distract people in that communication. And then there's another bias at the other end. And that other bias is the receiver's bias. So we might start with the facts and end up with something very different at the other end. And then we have a feedback loop on this. And that's where we can seek to understand and make sure that we are clear with what the communication has been and ask the questions to clarify, to make sure we really understand as the receiver, but also as the sender, asking questions to make sure the receiver has really understood our intent. And all of that requires empathy, because we need to understand the other person's position, what they're going through and what's actually happening. Because that's the only way that we can try and combat some of the bias issues that tend to change the message as we go through. And that's why the communication process is really quite important, to make sure that it is conducted with empathy and with respect. Now, there's certain keys to effective communication. So what's your objective? You need to actually understand what your objective is first. Otherwise, you've got no hope of communicating that to anybody else. What's in it for the audience? Why would they want to hear it? Why do they need the information? What are their needs? And if you can meet their needs in how you're communicating with them, that will make a big difference to their receptiveness of the information. You need to try and define terms, but where you can, avoid technical language if possible. You've got to tell the story. Storytelling is an incredibly effective way of communicating with humans. We actually love the art of storytelling, understanding how things came about. And so we need to make sure when we share information with people, we share it in a compelling manner so they actually want to hear the story. It's good to try and break up some communication as well into very manageable sections. So don't overwhelm people with 30 minutes of a dump of information and expect them to walk away with all of that information that you needed to give them. You might need to give them an overview and then individual bits of information as the time unfolds into the future. It can be really helpful to show cause and effect. If we do this, this is going to happen for these reasons. So that's why we need to do something else. So it can be really useful to show that cause and effect. Try and be concise. Especially in difficult times, we need to make sure that we do communicate effectively and concisely. if we become very verbose and just use a lot of words, it can tire people out in trying to deal with all the words that are just getting thrown at them, whether it's verbal, whether it's written. So we need to try and sum up what's the important thing into manageable chunks and keep giving that level of information out. And don't be afraid to admit that you don't know something. As I said earlier, this takes a lot of courage. I don't know the answer to that. I'll get back to you. Or I don't know the answer to that. Is this something you can help me with? Engaging people to help you in the process can make them feel a lot better as well, because all of a sudden we've started to give people some sort of sense of control and influence in their own world, which at this particular point in time, I think a lot of people are perhaps missing. They don't feel they're in control of what's going on because things just keep happening to them. Is there a way that they can be involved in the process by helping with the solutions? They become part of the solution, not just subjected to the action. Now, if the message is not getting through, you need to go back and think about how it was communicated. Did they understand the intent of what you were trying to do? Very early in my career, I had a manager. I was working in a supervisory role, and I had a team of people, and I was having trouble getting the message through to them. And at one point in time, I walked into my boss's office and said, "How many times do I have to keep telling them the same thing?" And she just looked at me and said, "As many times as it takes. It's actually my problem if I'm not getting the message through. What do I need to adjust to make sure I can get the message through and verify that people have understood it through questioning to make sure that they understand the intent so that they can actually understand and go forward with what I need them to do?" Because as a leader, if I can't get them to do what they need to do, if I can't get them to achieve that shared goal we have, then I am not doing very well as a leader, because my role is to take people where they need to be. Now, one of the challenges here is that to get outcomes, you need to have trust. And we don't often focus on trust, particularly in the workplace. Sometimes I just make an assumption that people trust us. But I challenge you to think about some of the people that you do work with and think about, do you trust them? And if in your mind you can start to think, oh, there perhaps is someone that I don't really trust, then why do you think everybody trusts you if there are people you don't trust? And trust doesn't just happen. It doesn't happen over specific time. It actually requires actions. And there's some certain parts of it that are vital. There's said to be 4 elements of trust. We need all 4 of them to actually have the trust at the end. So the first one, sincerity. Does what you say match what you do? If you're saying one thing and doing another, then you're not coming across as sincere, and that will undermine your presenting as a trustworthy person at that point. Competence is another interesting part of it, because often we get caught up in, well, how's that relevant in trust? But it comes down to, are you capable of doing what you claim? You say you can do this, but are you actually competent in doing it? Reliability. This is how well have you delivered in the past? What's your track record? If you have a track record of often failing to meet commitments, there is going to be a trust deficit in your relationships with people. And involvement. Are you actually interested in my needs? Do you actually care whether I succeed or fail as part of your team? That makes a huge difference. Now, there's 4 elements there. All 4 of them need to be present for trust to exist and work well. And this means that in some ways, trust actually becomes situational. So if we think about, would you trust your spouse to fly you in a plane? Now, the answer might be no, because they're not a pilot. They're not meeting the competence level. But you might trust that same spouse to drive you in a car because they are competent at driving. So trust most definitely is situational and needs to be thought about from that perspective as situational. There are some things that you won't be trusted in and other things that you will be trusted in. I just want to touch briefly on what's called VUCA. Now, some of you may or may not have heard of this. And I think without doubt, we're certainly in a VUCA situation at the moment. Volatile, uncertain, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is actually a US military term, and it was coined after the end of the Cold War because all of a sudden no one knew who the enemy was anymore. And so it created some challenges. So if we start at volatility, there are certainly parts of this that we understand. So we understand, for example, at the moment of what's going on, how transmission occurs of COVID-19. We understand that reasonably well now. From an uncertainty perspective, can I impact what's happening? Where's my circle of influence on this process? What can I do to try and help this situation? This can often lead to some uncertainty in what we do. If we jump to complexity, the information is increasing day by day. But there's so much information coming at us now, so many stats. We've all seen the curves. Have we flattened the curve yet? How are the transmission rates going? There's so much data. We're now starting to be overwhelmed by it. And lastly, ambiguity. We have a lot of known unknowns, so things we don't know. But there's also still a whole lot of unknown unknowns, which is always that wonderful, confusing Rumsfeldism. But it actually does make sense in this particular application. There are a lot of unknown unknowns still in where we're going. What will our businesses look like when we come out of this at the other end? We just don't actually know yet. And so I think in this particular instance, it's interesting to understand that we are currently sitting within all of the VUCA parts in different aspects of what's going on. And we need to recognise as leaders as well that all of us are in this situation together. And our teams at times need to realise that actually we don't have all the answers. We need their help too, which means we need to be willing to admit that to them. Okay, in preparing for this, I actually came across a very useful guidance document that was produced by the Australian government back in 2018 called Decision Making During a Crisis. And basically what this document outlines is that fundamental leadership and communication skills are vital, and these apply to all aspects of our business and our life, including how we keep ourselves, our families, and our colleagues safe as we keep going through this process. Whether it's crisis decision making to deal with, do we shut down a particular part of plant? Do we initiate a different response for what's going on? Who are our essential workers in our facility, and how are we going to deal with keeping them safe if they are needed to operate? How are we coping with their travelling back and forth? All these sorts of aspects. Now, the application may need to vary in a crisis or situation. Depending on what the situation is, will depend on what pieces of information you take out of this that can be useful to you. So whether you are managing a chemical plant that is now being rediverted to produce sanitizer, or whether you are managing a manufacturing plant that's been able to tool up to build ventilators, or whether you're actually just working your standard process because what you currently produce is vital. Toilet paper manufacturers, whatever process it is, whether you're in the health sector, whatever process it is, you need to pick out what's useful for you. Now, this document actually goes through 6 characteristics for decision making. I'm going to take you through all 6 of them. So it starts with, up the top, confirming authority and direction. Then we move on to establishing psychological safety, using explicit and tacit knowledge, managing expectations, managing cognitive bias, and recording those decisions. And I'll take you through each of these in detail. So if we want to talk about confirming authority and direction, people need to know who's in charge, who's accountable, who's making the decisions. They want direction and answers, and clarity and consistency is vital in this. They need to know who to turn to when they need help. We don't need confusion about who's in charge. We don't need co-captains right now. We need someone we can look to in charge. Now, This does then highlight the clear difference between two different methods of leadership. You've got the command and control aspect, or you actually might more naturally be a consultative decision maker. You may find that command and control is more needed now. So you may need to adjust your natural style to deal with confirming authority and setting direction so everybody knows where they're going and what direction to look into. Establishing psychological safety. So this is where members of the leadership team need to be able to voice their concerns. This is speaking up without fear or favour for what they have to say. It's not about reaching consensus, and it's not about a consultative decision making, but it's about respectful challenge. If you're part of a team and you think the person in charge is making the wrong decision, you need to be able to have that challenge and that discussion. And that may mean you need to seek other information or input from other people. Asking questions as much as possible will help you get to better decision making. But you need to set up a safe environment for people to be able to challenge the leader. So one of the things I typically do with my staff, and whenever I have new staff, is at the very beginning, I give them permission to challenge me on my decisions. And I ask them to challenge me if they think I'm making the wrong decision. And we will then have a mature conversation where they can challenge why they think I'm making the wrong decision. After we have that conversation, sometimes they change my mind and get me to see a different point of view, and I make a different decision. Sometimes my original decision stands because they haven't yet convinced me why it was not the right decision. At that point, command and control may well take over and say, okay, we've had the discussion, we've heard the issues, we're still doing this, now we implement. So you can challenge. Challenge doesn't always mean it's going to change people's minds, but you need to allow people to challenge. That way you will get better decision making. Using explicit and tacit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is easily identified, accessed and shared. It might be procedures, it might be the policy or the forms that you're going to use to drive certain activities. Tacit knowledge is our experience, insights and intuition. So these are the things that we know intuitively because we've seen that pattern before. We know which way it's going to go if we make that decision. And you need to use both types of these knowledge as an input into assessing the risk of what's going on. So keep in mind, when you start to put information into the risk assessments at this time, you may need to accept that not all information can be proved or verified or sourced. Some of it will be your experience because you've seen this before. You've been in this particular type of issue before and you know what's going to happen next. So we actually need to also be able to rely on our gut instinct of what's going on. Managing expectations. So we need to be careful because people's attitudes are influenced by their expectations, and there will be external and internal obligations. So I'm sure every one of us at the moment has been overwhelmed in our email about companies who we may have had something to do with once a long time ago, and they have our email address, emailing us to tell us precisely how they're dealing with COVID-19 and what steps they're taking. And we just don't really need that anymore. We've had enough of these emails. I think everybody's getting them from all sorts of weird places. And you think, did I ever even have anything to do with that organisation? How do they even have my email to be telling me this? But that is actually them dealing with their external expectations and trying to manage it. So they're trying to show you as their customer of some point in time that they are taking this seriously and they have implemented things for your safety and the safety of their staff. So that's why they're doing it. Yes, we're all sick of getting the emails, but you've got to understand why they're actually doing it. And those emails will be different to the internal obligations on managing expectations. So internally, employees are going to need far more detail and different information as well. And we need to understand who needs what pieces of information and make sure that we get that communicated out, because communication is the key to managing expectations and setting people's expectations. So, for example, for an internal obligation, you might actually be doing something along the lines of, every day we'll deliver an internal staff briefing at 11 a.m, go to this link and you'll get the latest update from us. And if you've got any questions in the meantime, here's where you send your questions to get answered. That's actually setting expectations for people. So every day at 11 o'clock, they know that they can get the latest information they might need to do their job. So they're going to tune in at 11 o'clock to understand what's going on. If you don't set something like that up, if you don't set up those expectations, then you may have the situation that they're constantly bombarding everybody with questions and no one has the answers. Or we're seeing a different situation occur where people are just feeling completely lost. They don't know what to do. They don't know what direction to go in. They feel lost because their expectations have not been managed. We need to set their expectations and then work to it. That's part of the trust part. How well have you delivered in the past? Managing cognitive bias. First of all, we need to recognise that we all have cognitive bias. 3 of the biases that are the most prevalent when we talk about decision making is, first of all, anchoring. So this is where we rely only on one key piece of information and we ignore the other pieces of information that actually might be telling us something different, because we're just relying on that one piece of information. The next one's confirmation bias. This is where we look for data that confirms our original assumptions. I'm expecting that test to pass, so I'm going to look for all the data that makes that test look like it's passed, even if other data suggests it didn't pass. And the third one is overconfidence bias. This is believing that our judgment is better than it actually is. And those 3 biases can really divert good decision making into decisions that we may regret or have to deal with later. Just a couple of ways to deal with that. I talked earlier about, allowing your team to actually challenge you. You might actually pick a team member that is the one that challenges any of these biases when they see them popping up. If you're focusing on one piece of information, they say, hey, hang on, we've got other information as well. We need to look at it all together, not just that one piece. Give them the permission to dig down and see when bias is occurring. This is a little bit similar to De Bono's 6 hats and having the black hat in the room, that devil's advocate, that person that's looking to make sure we're not getting caught up in the biases. And typically that would be their sole task as part of it, to make sure that we're considering all the information and making the best possible decisions that can be made at the time. Recording decisions. This is really important. We need to document what was decided and why, because this keeps everybody informed. We should have a designated platform for recording information, and these sorts of things should be defined in your business continuity or possibly even in your emergency response plans. This is so that everyone knows where to go to find the information. And importantly, visualization of the decisions can be really useful for people to challenge the biases. They can see how the decision was reached and actually question to understand whether there was a bias that did come into this. And this really comes down to the idea that in the past, I used to work in the aviation fuel business. And one of the things that we used to say all the time was, if you didn't write it down, it never happened. So you might be doing your checks, you might be making your decisions. If you didn't write it down, it never happened. Because there's no evidence to show that you followed a thought process and got to a position. There's no evidence to actually help you see whether that decision was a really good one and maybe you should be replicating it in other areas. So if it's not written down, it never happened. You have to record your decisions. I'm just now going to finish off with a last little couple of bits. I want to talk about self-care, and this is from the work of Graham Cowan, and I'd certainly recommend you go and check out his website. Really interesting stuff around how to take care of yourself in situations like this. And it's really important to remember that, as he says, self-care is not selfish. If you don't take care of yourself, you cannot take care of others. We've got to remember that this can go on for quite some time. We're not in a sprint, we're in a marathon. We need to pace and we need to make sure we make it to the end. So slow and steady is what we need at the moment. So some tips for that are make sure you schedule some exercise time. Even as a leader, you have to take a break to exercise. And keep in mind that exercising and going outside and getting a little bit of sunshine actually keeps you healthier as well. You need to create a routine for what you're doing. And this is actually about setting expectations, your own and those of your team. So, what are you doing in terms of how are you going to work? If we're now all working from home, are you just rolling out of bed and wandering to the desk? Whereas previously you would have got up, you would have had a shower, you'd have eaten breakfast, and you would have transited to work. Well, you still need to get up, have a shower, eat breakfast, maybe take some of that transit time to read the paper or engage with family or friends. Keep a routine. Don't let your work at home drift into an enormous amount of variation. But you still do need to have some flexibility to take breaks. You need to be able to take a break, go outside, go for a walk, pat the dog, do whatever it is, do the laundry. Take a break from your work to keep you engaged in what you can then do. And importantly, you really have to make an effort to connect with others. Humans are very social creatures and we need contact with others. So if you think about it, when you would have gone to the office, there would have been instances each day where at some point you would have gone to get a cup of coffee and just had a chat with someone in the corridor or by the water cooler. We don't get to do those things anymore at the moment. So we actually need to make an effort to do them. And we can make an effort to do them by reaching out virtually. Have a virtual coffee break with your team on a regular basis, just so that you can touch base. And you're not actually going to talk about work. You're going to talk about the latest crazy thing your dog did or what's happening with whatever. Did you see what they said on the news last night? Whatever it is, we need to make sure we connect with others and have those conversations, just like you would in the office. Other things to do, we've started actually having virtual dinners with friends. So people that we would normally be in contact with and see quite regularly, we now have a virtual dinner booked in. So we all log on to our little webinar or virtual meeting account, have our own dinners and sit around and talk to each other over the dinner table over the internet. And it actually does kind of work quite well, which was a bit surprising when I tried it for the first time. But these things are really important for you because you then still need to show team care as well. And so the team care is where you do need to check in with your team regularly, whether that's by Skype or Messenger or whatever it is, WhatsApp group. You need to touch base with people more than you did previously, because previously they were all in an office and had various different touch points of communication. Now we're all isolated. We still need these touch points. We actually need to force them to occur. So whatever works. And when you do check in with them, there's probably 4 questions to think about asking. Are you okay? Do you feel safe or unsafe at the moment for some reason? Now, the fact is that you need to deal with this question. If people are feeling unsafe, you need to have the discussion about why. And is there something that they could be doing differently or that you could be doing to assist them in that? You shouldn't move past the unsafe question until it's resolved in a way that's acceptable. And that might mean that you're talking about something personal with them, but it's actually important to do that too. What did you get done yesterday? What did you achieve? Did you have a good thing that you got done? What are you trying to do today? What's your number one goal? Are there any impediments to you getting to your number one goal? What could you do there? So they're just a couple of tips about how to deal with self-care and team care as well. I hope that that this has helped you. As I said, I don't have the answers. All I can do is share my experience, and maybe that will help you in some way. I'm happy to take any questions, so I'll ask Fiona if she's got any questions that have come in from you all. Thanks.
Okay, Trish. I've got one here from Aaron who would like to know how would you advise line managers or supervisors against micromanaging when staff are working from their respective homes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Aaron. And this really comes down to trust, unfortunately, and trust takes time to build. So you might actually find a way to help them deal with that is things like saying, okay, um, how about I report to you each day what's actually going on, rather than the manager then feeling the need, because that person is going to be sitting in their home office trying to understand what's going on and understand if everybody's doing their job or if they're not, if they're slacking off. If you actually proactively provide information back, then that allows them to understand a little bit of what's going on and might make it a bit easier for them to loosen those reins and let you just get on and do your job. Any other questions, Fiona?
Not at this stage.
No? Okay. No?
Feel free to pop them. Oh, here we go.
Oh, another one. Okay.
So Lara's here and she would like to know how do you check if you haven't overdone the communication?
Well, that comes down, I guess, a little bit to the answer to the last question about the micromanaging. You do need to be careful that your communication doesn't verge into that micromanaging part. And sometimes part of that is just engaging a little bit on that social level and saying, okay, so what's happening? And sometimes actually just saying to your team, so is this level of communication about right for you? We can ask those questions as well. Is there something you need me to be doing, either more of, less of, or keep doing? So, I often try to evaluate my own performance with keep, stop, start. I ask my team quite regularly what they want me to keep doing, what they want me to stop doing, and what they want me to start doing. And so sometimes we ask those questions. That can then actually allow people to tell us, if we've given them permission to give us feedback and to challenge, say, actually, you don't need to check in with me every day. I'll let you know if that changes. Maybe we do it every second day. So have the conversation and ask about whether the communication levels are right for everybody involved, understanding that different members of the team may need different levels of communication because every person is individual. Every person needs to know, every person needs to be addressed and communicated with in the best way for them. As leaders, we need to adapt and change how we do things. Thanks, Fiona.
Okay, so Jenny wants to know, other than sharing pet photos, have you heard of any other great things people have started to do to have virtual fun as a team?
I've heard of people having Friday night drinks together, or as I said, the coffee breaks. Just the coffee breaks of we'll all have a coffee at 10 o'clock and Skype each other and have a chat face to face. So there's some of the other things. I haven't heard of anything else specifically at the moment. There's an enormous number of memes going around on social media. Most of them are acceptable for the workplace. Some would not be. So, just remember that even in this time, we still have to exercise discretion about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. But some of them can be quite amusing, just to share with each other around, some of them have, someone sharing their interpretive dance and please come and dance with me as they go through and do some weird interpretive dance activity. Sharing some of these things can actually be quite helpful in just creating that camaraderie. Maybe it's meeting for lunch once a week virtually. So get a little bit creative about some of those things. That's probably about all I can add there, Fiona.
Now, Mark would like to know, is the reference decision making during a crisis document from the government worth reading by the audience? And is it really as practical as the title states?
Yes, it is. It's not very long at all. It is only, I'm just looking it up now, it's 19 pages. It is very short, very succinct, and I confess I was a little bit surprised to find it, and was quite impressed by it. So it is short, sharp. It gives you examples and suggestions to consider in things, which is where I pulled out bits of information to produce the slides. So I would certainly recommend downloading that and taking a look at it. I think it was well worth it. Interestingly, it was created, as I said, back in 2018, and it was created by the Organisational Resilience Department in Home Affairs, believe it or not, all around business continuity.
Okay, Reese has a question. How have you dealt with differences in age and digital capabilities in teams comprising a range of skills, etc.?
So this is actually where communication, again, becomes really important. And sometimes you actually just need to talk people through it very very simply, and it is that, make sure you communicate in small chunks to people. So I've had instances where I've had to talk people through how to connect to a Zoom meeting with me. And the challenge is that normally you'd say, well, we'll Zoom and I'll show you what it looks like on my screen. But when they haven't managed to connect to it, you can't do that yet. So it's talking through, okay, so can you show me what's going on through FaceTime, perhaps, so I can see what's on your screen and point out which way you need to get there. So it's building up capability slowly. So it might be that you need to get them onto FaceTime or whatever equivalent on your mobile phone service so that they can point their phone at something, and then you can talk to them about what they need to do and start to walk through step-by-step guidance on how to set something up. So I've used that. I've used detailed instructions for people of, you need to do this, and then this screen is going to appear, and you need to click that when that happens. So sometimes you need to lay out the detail for people, and sometimes just talk them through on the phone while they actually do it. They're more than capable of doing it. They might not realise they're capable of doing it. Sometimes they just need a reassuring voice on the other end to help them through it. So that's what I've done in this instance to try and help people deal with some of that.
Okay, Greg would like to know, how would you modify the communication with your team depending on whether the individuals were introverts or extroverts? And how would you encourage more one-on-one communication in a crisis rather than constant team updates?
Okay, introvert versus extrovert. That's an interesting one. I'm actually a natural introvert, which most people are very surprised at, and my team are probably more extroverted a little bit, although a little bit of introversion in there too. What I find is that because there was a pre-existing relationship, the introvert-extrovert bit doesn't necessarily really come into play, I've found. So we see that the way I'm communicating is similar, because I've actually always had a geographically dispersed team. So I've always had to rely on virtual engagement with my team. But there's other people within the Melbourne office that I'm also making sure there is regular little Skype messages too, so that's the individualised part, or group emails too, so that people know what's going on, just to give them that update, make a suggestion, hey, I did this, I succeeded in something, this is, we need to celebrate this, whatever it is. So there's options to just sort of try and deliver in the way that people want to see it. I read something today, a lecturer was saying that it was actually interesting. They did a class virtually and had far more engagement than they ever got with the face-to-face class, because the introverts were willing to ask a question by typing it in. So we may actually see better communication come out of this as an unintended consequence, which would be fantastic if that did happen. What was the second part of that question, Fiona?
The second part was, how would you encourage more one-on-one communication in a crisis rather than constant team updates?
Right, so that's, as I said, that's just the individual messaging about something here or there. So, for example, Fiona and I were messaging quite a bit this morning on Skype as we prepared to deliver this webinar, making sure that everything was set, exchanging some ideas with each other. We'd normally do that if I was in the office face-to-face, but we didn't have that luxury. So there was just like, use the apps and the systems. We've got some amazing technology. Get creative in how you use it, and work with your team to get them comfortable with them engaging in it as well. Thanks, Fiona.
Now we've got another one from Cyril. Can you provide an example on how you changed your approach at times where the team didn't get the message across? So the example that you used in the presentation of how many times do I need to keep telling them, and your manager said as many times as you need.
Yeah, so a lot of that came back to actually thinking and going back to the idea of understanding what's in it for the audience. Why do they care about this piece of information? Or why should they care about this piece of information I need to impart to them? So what's in it for them? If you can find what's in it for that individual, they will not only be receptive to the information that you need to communicate, they'll actually suck it up like nothing else. They desperately want it, especially if there's a vacuum of communication or information at that point in time. So an example, I was working with a group of refinery operators around making sure that when they were dealing with the production of the jet fuel, that it was all done to the required standards. And some of those standards were kind of tedious, but we had to follow them because people's lives depended on getting this right. And then it dawned on me one day of what matters to these people. Why would they want to follow all of these things that they seemingly see as tedious, even though I've explained why it's important? And so part of it was I then took them on an excursion and we went to the airport and we looked at the planes and we looked at the people getting on the planes. And I'd found what was their trigger, what was the need for them in their audience. Their families and they get on planes and go places. So the work they do is vitally important in producing good fuel for the planes so the planes can safely fly. So that's an example where I couldn't get the message through. So I changed my messaging. I changed what they needed. So I met their needs and actually created in them a want and a need for the information rather than the other way around. How are we going for questions there, Fiona? Have we
We do have quite a few coming through, so maybe we'll just have time for one more and then we can pass on questions to you to answer after the webinar.
Yep.
So this one is from Chris, and he would like to know, what role does psychological safety play for leaders?
Oh, it is enormous. We all need to I talked about self-care as being so important, and that is critically important. We all need to, as leaders, feel that we are in as safe a place as we can be to operate, make the decisions and do the things we have to do. So we need to figure out how to create that psychological safety for ourselves, because other people may not be able to produce it for us. We need to be comfortable. We need to feel safe in what we're doing so we can deliver on our outcomes. And so you need to understand what's lacking for you if you're not feeling that safety at the moment, and how you can try and develop that, whether it is more contact with someone, whether it is that you need to increase your daily exercise. There'll be all sorts of different things for everybody to try and make sure that they're actually achieving psychological safety, because without it, we can't make good decisions. When people get scared, we actually don't behave rationally. And a way to describe that at the moment is, I think we've all seen the lack of toilet paper on the shelves at the supermarkets. Now, people really don't need that much toilet paper. It's irrational to be buying toilet paper in the volumes that people were buying toilet paper. But they were not feeling psychologically safe. They were not feeling in control, and they were scared. And that was one thing they could seemingly control, which is why they did it. So in the most case, why they did it. So we need to understand what it is about you as the individual and how can you create your psychological safety to keep going. And that may mean reaching out and reaching out to the likes of Beyond Blue or other credible organisations that provide mental health support as well. It may mean having a consultation with a psychologist virtually. That's happening a lot virtually as well now. There's all sorts of different things you can do to really understand what your triggers are and what you need to do about them. So we might finish up with that question there then, Fiona. Fiona will take a note of all the remaining questions, and I'll get back to you all with the best answers I can provide to your questions over the next couple of days. It may take me a little while because it sounds like there was actually quite a few more questions to come. But also, please feel free to reach out on our social media and continue the conversation. So whether it is on our Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook account, reach out to us, ask questions. We can continue that conversation as we go through. And please remember, as we go through this, we all need to look after each other and keep each other safe so that we can all come through this together. And reiterating what at times seems trite, but actually is vitally important, is we all need to practice our social distancing, but stay connected, as well as remembering to cover our mouth and nose when we sneeze or cough, and make sure that we wash our hands thoroughly for 20 seconds with soap and water. Soap and water is a better option than hand sanitizer. Soap will behave and perform better in that instance. So please do take care and stay safe. And as I said, we'll have several of the webinars coming up over the coming months to keep you informed. And I'll get back to the remaining questions. Thanks a lot, Fiona.